You may remember back at the beginning of this unit on ecology, I talked about the various different levels of organization that there are in biology and pointed out the ones that we were going to be studying in this unit. We started out by talking about the population level, a population being a group of individuals all of the same species in roughly the same place. Then we've gone on to talk about community level ecology. A community, of course, it consists of multiple interacting species all in the same area. Now what we're going to be talking about is the ecosystem level of organization. An ecosystem is basically a community or communities living in an area plus all of the non-living stuff that they interact with. So for example, in this photograph, you can see that there are animal and plant communities here. This community might consist of, say, these acacia trees, these elephants, the low grass here, the birds that are feeding off the insects that are being scared up by the elephants, and so on, all the living things. The ecosystem also would take into account things like the air, the water that comes from this melting snow, the soil underneath all of the plants. So basically everything that is made of matter that interacts in this whole area. And generally, when we're thinking about ecosystems, we're thinking about things on a really pretty big scale. When you're thinking about a community, you might be thinking of, say, a small patch of forest. But when you're talking about things that are happening on the ecosystem level, usually you're talking about very, very large scale patterns. In fact, a lot of ecosystem ecology is at the scale of the entire planet. So for example, one of the things that we're going to be looking at today is the global carbon cycle, basically the movement of all the carbon atoms on the planet Earth. What I am going to be focusing on in this lecture is the movement of nutrients or matter through the living and non-living components of an ecosystem. You're already familiar with the idea of how energy flows through an ecosystem. That's this diagram here, and as you know, energy enters the ecosystem through the producer level and then is passed along up the food chain to consumers. When organisms die, they enter the detritus. And that in turn serves as food for a different food chain, the detritivores, those are organisms that eat detritus, and decomposers, organisms that break down non-living stuff into its simpler components. Along the way, of course, some of the energy is lost as heat as it gets used or wasted by the various different living organisms. So that's energy flow, that you already should be familiar with. Now I want to turn your attention to how matter flows through an ecosystem. And it's very similar. This makes sense, of course, because energy moves through an ecosystem in the form of chemical energy. It moves through an ecosystem stored in high energy chemical bonds. So obviously those chemicals the atoms between which there are these chemical bonds, obviously those have to be moving in parallel through the ecosystem in the same way. And that's what's shown in this diagram over here. Producers, some of the atoms that producers are made up of, get consumed by primary consumers, some of their atoms get eaten by secondary consumers, and so on. But a lot of that biomass is going to die without getting eaten by anybody, and it becomes detritus. The atoms in that detritus may then get consumed by detritivores or decomposers, and then they may in turn become detritus, just like what you see in this diagram. And you'll notice if you look at the green arrows in this diagram and compare them to blue arrows in this diagram, they're almost identical, with a couple of exceptions. One of the exceptions is that energy is lost from an ecosystem. When it gets used up, it gets dissipated as heat, it cannot be recaptured. This is not true of matter. every atom that is in this grass here will end up going somewhere. Okay, it will end up being eaten by a grasshopper. It may get pooped out by the grasshopper. It may become part of the grasshopper's biomass. Um, or the atom in this grass might end up going into the detritus. It may be that it changes form in some way. So a carbon atom might go from being incorporated into cellulose in the grass to becoming part of a carbon dioxide molecule in the atmosphere. But wherever it goes, the atom goes somewhere. It never disappears, and new atoms are never created, at least not under circumstances that are relevant for this course. Of course, you can do some very funky things to matter and energy and things like particle accelerators, but nature is rather short on particle accelerators, and so we're just going to focus on what happens to atoms most of the time under normal circumstances. And under normal circumstances, you don't lose atoms and you don't gain new ones. One other interesting difference between the way that matter moves through an ecosystem and the way that energy moves through an ecosystem is that the matter cycles. So you'll notice over here in this diagram, basically the energy is largely making a one-way trip. It goes up the food chain, some of it goes down here, might go back up, might cycle through a couple times through the detritus, but ultimately it's all going to get lost. Whereas there's this big arrow here, and that represents the cycling of nutrients back to producers. That's what happens to a lot of the atoms, a lot of the nutrients that are here in the detritus. When it gets broken down, those nutrients get released into the soil, producers take it back up. And so in this matter flow diagram, atoms can just go around over and over and over and over. Whereas in the energy flow diagram, maybe a packet of energy is going to make a couple of trips through here, but pretty quickly it's all going to be lost as heat. One thing that's not shown in this diagram that perhaps should be is that there are other non-living forms of matter besides detritus. So an atom that is part of a living organism one day can end up being released in a non-living form, like say carbon dioxide. Or it can undergo denitrification and end up in the atmosphere as nitrogen gas. You can have atoms from a living organism get rearranged to form water molecules. When those water molecules are released from the organism, they can go into the ocean as water. So there's this constant interchange of atoms, not only among the living organisms and the non-living former organisms in an ecosystem, but between all the other things in an ecosystem that are made up of the same kinds of stuff, the same elements. Which elements are important in ecosystems? There are a few of them that you should particularly focus on. And there's a funny term here that you should know. The elements that are important in living organisms are generally, or at least often, referred to as nutrients. Okay, you may think of nutrients as things like vitamin B1 and riboflavin and stuff like that, but in the ecosystem context, nutrients are an element that organisms need. There are a few elements that we're going to focus on particularly today. This is a chart that shows basically what organisms are made of from an elemental perspective. The big three that start off the list, no matter which kind of organism you are, bacterium, plant, or animal, the big three are going to be carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. And we're going to be particularly interested in carbon out of these three. Next up is nitrogen, which is also very important, even though it's much less common than hydrogen or oxygen, which we're not going to talk about at all. And then down here, way down here, there's phosphorus. Another element, or another nutrient, for which the cycling is very, very important. Why are nitrogen and phosphorus interesting while, say, oxygen and hydrogen aren't? Well, it's because those elements, those nutrients, are very hard to get a hold of. and therefore they're often limiting for the growth and reproduction of living things. Change those nutrient cycles and you can have dramatic effects on an ecosystem. Hydrogen, on the other hand, is available not just in the air, but in every single water molecule. It's not hard for living organisms to pop those hydrogen atoms off of a water molecule and use them for something else. So hydrogen is basically never limiting. If you change the hydrogen cycle, nobody will even notice. Carbon is not exactly limiting for living things. However, as you're probably aware, carbon is very, very important. The carbon cycle is very important because it could determine the life or death of most ecosystems on this planet as we know them today. What we're going to be looking at for the rest of today's lecture are three particular nutrient cycles: carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus are the nutrients we're going to be focusing on. And there's a very useful way of conceptualizing or thinking about these nutrient cycles, and here it is. You can think of nutrient cycles as basically a set or a system of reservoirs that are connected by fluxes. A reservoir is a physical place or a type of matter in which atoms of some nutrient can be found. So for example, if we're thinking about carbon, there are carbon atoms in plant biomass. There are also carbon atoms that are found in carbon dioxide molecules in the atmosphere. Okay, and these carbon atoms that are part of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere sometimes are taken into plant biomass and become part of, say, a glucose molecule or a cellulose molecule. Sometimes the carbon atoms in a glucose or cellulose molecule get rearranged and are released as part of carbon dioxide molecules. These fluxes, these gray arrows, represent the fluxes. A flux is the movement of a nutrient from one reservoir to another. And we usually talk about fluxes as a rate, the rate at which atoms are moving from one reservoir to another. Often it's expressed as a mass. So for example, in a particular area, over the course of a year, you might see plant biomass, carbon atoms in plant biomass, becoming carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at a rate of 20.2 kilograms per year. The reverse rate might be slightly higher, which means that you're building up plant biomass. Okay, so every one of these fluxes is also driven by some mechanism. Okay, there's a reason why carbon atoms move from the atmosphere into plant biomass. That reason is photosynthesis. The mechanism that causes the carbon atoms in plant biomass to become CO2 in the atmosphere is usually respiration, although decomposition can also contribute a fair bit to this. The reason that it's useful to think about these reservoirs, these fluxes, and the mechanism that drive these fluxes is that they can give you a handle on what happens when things are altered in a nutrient cycle. So for example, if a mechanism is speeded up or it's slowed down, it's going to change the size of a flux, and in turn, that can change the amount of an element that's bound up in a particular reservoir. So for example, if you really heat stress plants, the respiration rate goes up a lot faster than the photosynthesis rate does. And so this flux out of plant biomass is going to be larger than the flux of carbon atoms coming in. If this goes on for a long period of time, plant biomass will actually start to get smaller because carbon atoms are moving out of that biomass faster than they're being replenished. Similarly, if you were to do something that changed the rate of photosynthesis, that might also alter the size of this reservoir by changing the fluxes that go in and out. There are some reservoirs that are so huge that you might think that they can't really be affected by fluxes, but even a gigantic reservoir, like the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, it turns out can be affected by activities that alter fluxes, and we're learning altogether too much about that today than we wanted to know. One thing one thing you'll definitely need to keep in mind as we go over this material is that there are mechanisms that respond to the amount of nutrient that's in a particular reservoir. So for example, if there is not much plant biomass, then photosynthesis can't occur very rapidly. Okay, so the size of these fluxes, the flux due to the respiration, the flux due to photosynthesis, really depends on how many plants there are. And so the size of this reservoir is going to be connected to these flow rates. In a different way, a different way that this sometimes works is, so for example, if you were to increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we've certainly been doing this experiment, it actually acts as fertilizer for plants. Because there's so much CO2 available, photosynthesis actually speeds up. And so this flux increases, allowing this reservoir to get larger. Okay, there are some reservoirs that are not going to respond when, there are some fluxes that are not going to respond when you change the size of a reservoir. Okay, so you need to be aware of which ones are which. In general, what often happens is, and you should be familiar with this from thinking about chemistry, if you're taking a chemistry course, when you increase the amount of some reactant, it tends to make a reaction go more rapidly. If you increase the amount of the reactant on the other side of an equation, it tends to drive a reaction in the reverse direction. And it's the same thing here. As with many reservoirs that are connected by fluxes, if you make one of the reservoirs larger, that tends to increase the fluxes going out of that reservoir. If you make if a reservoir becomes smaller, that tends to make the fluxes that are going out of that reservoir smaller as well. But again, there are exceptions. This is just a general principle that you'll want to keep in mind as we start looking at nutrient cycles. When you're building a model of a nutrient cycle, there's no really hard and fast way of doing it. What you include in that model really depends on what you're interested in looking at. A geologist might build a nutrient flow diagram or a nutrient cycle diagram that includes a lot of what's going on underground. Whereas someone who's primarily interested in the living community will build in a lot of details about animals and plants. So for example, a big difference here is if you were trying to teach grade school children about the carbon cycle, your carbon cycle might look like this, and this is perfectly accurate. If you're talking to a more sophisticated audience and you want to get into important details like the difference between shallow water and deep water for carbon storage, you would build a carbon cycle diagram that looks like this. If you were actually a climate modeler and you really needed to know exactly how much carbon dioxide there was going to be in the atmosphere in 100 years, you would use a model that's much, much more complicated. So for example, instead of just having vegetation, soil, and detritus all in one box, you might split them up with vegetation over here, soil here, detritus here, different boxes between which or among which there's lots of flow. You might even split the vegetation up into different kinds of vegetation. Okay, so these models can be made more complex or simpler depending on what you're trying to do with it. What we are going to be looking at mostly, and this is why many people are interested in nutrient cycling today, is because human beings have changed the cycles of nutrients in some very important ways. So that is definitely something we are going to be looking at as we look at the flow diagrams for carbon and nitrogen phosphorus. A couple more things that I want to point out. We are going to be talking about the flow of elements. So for example, nitrogen is an element and a nitrogen atom is the same no matter what molecule, or in this case ions, it is found in. Okay, however, the different forms of an element, or the different molecules that an element can show up in, are not necessarily going to be accessible by organisms. Organisms have very different relationships with, say, gaseous nitrogen than they do with, say, an ammonium ion. So for example, one of the things we're going to talk about is that there are only a few organisms that can carry out certain chemical transformations. When we get to the nitrogen cycle, we'll be talking a little bit about nitrogen-fixing bacteria. They're some of the only organisms on Earth that can take atmospheric nitrogen, this gas, and turn it into one of these forms. These are the forms that plants can actually take up and use to build plant matter. And so this transformation from this chemical form to this chemical form is a crucial step in allowing living organisms to get a hold of nitrogen atoms they can actually use. So in addition to the movement of atoms, we also need to be thinking about the transformation of molecules that contain those atoms. When you switch from one kind of molecule to another, that transformation can be very, very important.